White fragility. We must start here, not with its assumptions, not with its tactics, but with what it is. When I say white fragility, I'm not describing mere sensitivity or a passing discomfort. I'm naming a structure, a mode of governance, a political technology. White fragility is not weakness, it is armor. White fragility is the invisible emotional infrastructure that protects whiteness from accountability. It is the nervous system of coloniality, the reflex that activates whenever the reality of racism, domination, and historical violence is spoken aloud. It looks like trembling, but it functions as force. It looks like defensiveness, but it acts as domination. Think about it. When whiteness is challenged, it does not collapse. It recenters, it directs, it silences, it claims innocence. This is how white fragility is so effective. It is not about the feelings themselves, but about what those feelings do. The crocodile tears, the silence, the anger, the withdrawal. These are not just emotions, these are strategies. They are how colonial power survives in the everyday. In psychology, we might call this projection and denial. The unbearable truth that whiteness is built on exploitation, genocide, dispossession is pushed away, and in its place emerges injury. I feel attacked, I feel unsafe, I feel excluded. In political theory, we call it securitization. A state declares itself threatened, and in that declaration it gains extraordinary powers. White fragility does the same at the micro level. It declares critique a danger, and thereby justifies silencing, exclusion, and even punishment. In international relations, this is precisely how empires sustain themselves. The colonizer always presented conquest as defense. They said, "We are threatened by savagery, by backwardness, by barbarism." They frame domination as self-protection. White fragility is the same logic, translated into the everyday. Your critique of me is violence, therefore I must defend myself by shutting you down. And in decolonial theory, white fragility is a mask. Whiteness itself wears the mask, a mask of innocence, of benevolence, of fragility, hiding the machinery of domination beneath. Fanon saw this. He wrote about the crushing weight of colonial innocence, the colonizer who insists on his goodness even as he brutalizes. White fragility is that innocence, resurrected in every seminar, every policy meeting, every cultural encounter. And if you are Romani, indigenous, black, colonized, racialized, you know this mask. You have seen it. You have felt it. You speak your truth, and suddenly the whole room bends towards protecting the white subject who feels hurt. The conversation stops being about genocide, segregation, violence. It becomes about their emotions, their discomfort, their fear of being called racist. Do you see the sneaky inversion? The victim becomes aggressor. The aggressor becomes a victim. The history of our oppression disappears, replaced by the spectacle of their injury. So when I say white fragility, I'm naming not a personal flaw, but a collective defense system, a system that converts critique into aggression, and aggression into innocence. White fragility is not fragile at all. It is power. It is coloniality in emotional form. It is the refusal to respect, the refusal to listen, the refusal to carry responsibility. And until we understand this, until we strip away the mask, we will always be drawn back into its theater. The first tactic of white fragility is tone policing. It begins softly, almost politely. You speak of dispossession, and someone says, "Could you calm down, please?" You speak of genocide and they reply, "Your tone is making it hard for me to listen." You speak of centuries of violence and suddenly the real issue is not the violence itself, but your voice. Just notice how quickly the attention shifts. The brutality disappears, the weight of history evaporates. What remains on trail is you, your voice, your body, your way of speaking. Tone policing functions like a trap. The more urgent the truth, the more it disqualifies you. The more pain you carry, the more they insist you should speak gently, politely, rationally, as though the centuries of death and exclusion must be narrated with a smile, or else it becomes too much. Do you see the cruelty here? It is not the killing, not the forced sterilizations, not the segregated school, not the evictions, not the hunger that they call excessive. It is you naming them. Your voice becomes the crime. Tone policing always claims to protect dialogue, but in reality it ends it. It presents itself as civility, but it is discipline. It forces you to shrink yourself, to cut your words into safer shapes, to leave the fire of truth outside the room. And if you refuse, if you insist on speaking with the full force of your history, then suddenly you are the problem. You are the aggressor. You are the one disrupting peace. The tables are turned. The oppressed become the problem. The dominant become the injured. This is how white fragility works. It cannot bury the truth, so it rewrites the rules of conversation. It makes your voice illegitimate, not because you're wrong, but because you are too alive, too insistent, too unwilling to bow down. The trick is simple. The less you resemble yourself, the more legitimate you become. They want your knowledge without your anger, your testimony without your tears, your history without your flesh. But a truth drained of feelings is not truth at all. Tone policing is not about manners, it is about power. It is how white fragility survives exposure, by declaring that the way you reveal is unacceptable. So when they say, lower your voice, what they mean is, lower your truth. When they say, be calm, what they mean is, make yourself small enough for me to tolerate. When they say, don't be emotional, what they mean is don't bring your humanity into the room. And that's why tone policing is not just irritation. It is a weapon. It is the first wall of white fragility. A wall built to silence, to discipline, to strip your words of their force. Unless we name it, unless we break it, every critique will crush against it and die. Another tactic of white fragility is the myth of neutrality. They love this word, neutrality. They love to invoke it like a sacred charm. They say, I'm not political, I'm neutral, I'm simply describing facts. But look closely, neutrality is never neutral, it is always a position, and it is always the position of white power. Neutrality claims to be universal, but in practice, it always means white, Western, colonial, Orientalist, universal. When they say, we are just being neutral, what they mean is, we reserve the right to look at your suffering without being implicated in it. This is the arrogance of neutrality. It imagines that to stand above the battlefield is to be innocent, when in truth, it is simply another way of siding with the strong. Neutrality disguises itself as balance, but is a balance where one side carries centuries of weapons and the other carries only their bare hands. It says both must be treated the same. And in that illusion of fairness, violence is protected, oppression is excused, injustice is naturalized. Neutrality is a mask. Behind it hides the comfort of whiteness, which never needs to take a stand because the entire system is already standing for it. This is why neutrality is so beloved by white fragility. It allows them to continue their dominance while appearing innocent. It allows them to silence critique without raising their voice. It allows them to call your passion biased, your history subjective, your resistance emotional, while they pretend to be the voice of reason. But let's be clear, neutrality is not reason. Being neutral is being a coward. It is complicity dressed up as a virtue. Neutrality says to the oppressed, you must argue your humanity within the rules I set for you. Neutrality says to the colonized, prove your suffering to me in a language I recognize, or it does not exist. Neutrality says to the racialized, I'm not against you, but I will never be with you. I'm simply neutral. But in a world built on domination, neutrality is never neutral. It is always protection for the dominant, always another layer of white fragility. So let's name it for what it is. Neutrality is not peace. It is not fairness. It is not balance. Neutrality is the silence that allows oppression to breathe. Neutrality is the posture that gives violence permission to continue. Neutrality is the camouflage of power, and every time they hide behind it, they are not stepping outside of history. They are reinforcing the deepest injustices. White fragility thrives of demanding proof. Every time you speak of violence, exclusion, erasure, they say, can you give me evidence? Every time you narrate a wound passed down through generations, they say, where is the data? It is never enough that we leave the consequences in our bodies. It is never enough that our history is soaked in our blood, that our communities carries the scars of centuries. For white fragility, testimony is never proof, memory is never proof, existence itself is never proof. The demand for proof is not about knowledge, it is about control. It shifts the burden from them, the inheritors of violence, to us, the survivors of it. It says, we will only recognize your suffering if you can translate it into our archives, our statistics, our categories, our language. And here lies the cruelty. Those very archives were built to erase us. Those very statistics were designed to exclude us. Those very categories were written to render us inferior. So the demand for proof is a trap. They demand that we prove our humanity in the very system that denied it. And when we say we cannot, they smile. See? There is no evidence. You are exaggerating. The demand for proof is endless. Bring one study, and they will ask for another. Bring one archive, and they will question its credibility. Bring your lived experience, and they will dismiss it as anecdotal, just a family history. The point was never to respect, never to understand. The point was to exclude us, to drain us, to keep us busy justifying our words. Because the point was never to know, the point was to delay knowing, the point was to exhaust you, to drain you, to keep you so busy justifying your words that you never have the strength to continue your critique. White fragility asks for proof, the way a wall asks for bricks, endlessly, without ever intending to let you through. Imagine being asked to prove exclusion when the very room you are speaking in is structured to exclude you. Imagine being asked to prove your humanity as if humanity itself were not already the ground you stand on. This is not inquiry, it is denial dressed as inquiry. It is not curiosity, it is cruelty, disguised as a reason. And so the demand for proof becomes another phase of white fragility. It pretends to be intellectual, but it is profoundly anti-intellectual. It pretends to be rigorous, but it is profoundly dishonest. It pretends to be a search for truth, but it is only a shield against your truth. The question is never, do we have enough evidence? The question is always, what kind of evidence will whiteness ever accept? And the answer is, of course, none. So let me be clear. My existence is the proof. My people's survival is the proof. The fact that we are still here, still naming, still resisting, still refusing to disappear, that is the only proof that should be ever needed. If white fragility cannot recognize it, then the failure is not ours. The failure is the system they built to remain blind. Another tactic of white fragility is the endless ritual of recentering white innocence. The moment critique touches them, they rush not to confront the violence we name, but to protect the image of themselves as good, moral, fair, tolerant people. They say, "But I didn't mean it that way. You are misunderstanding me. You know I have Romani friends. You know I care about justice." Do you see what happens? The critique, which was about history, about power, about domination, is immediately dragged into the theater of personal feelings. The conversation is no longer about the wound inflicted on us. It is now about their wounded self-image. This is the alchemy of white fragility. It transforms centuries of oppression into a single play for sympathy. It takes a structural critique and turns it into a sentimental drama. It demands that we, the oppressed, pause our analysis in order to reassure the oppressor that they are still good. This obsession with innocence is not accidental. Innocence is the currency of whiteness. It is what allows white societies to colonize, enslave, exploit, and still narrate themselves as moral. Innocence is the mask that lets violence continue without guilt. And fragility is the performance that keeps the mask intact. When you confront them with injustice, the white people do not ask, "What must I change about myself?" They ask, "How do I make sure you still see me as innocent?" And so the entire conversation bends backwards to protect their self-image. But let's be clear, innocence is not harmless, innocence is violent. Because the more they protect their innocence, the more they erase our pain. The more they insist on their innocence, the more they refuse responsibility. The more they cling to innocence, the more they guarantee that the structures of domination remain untouched. And here lies another irony. White fragility imagines itself as weakness, trembling, misunderstood, hurt. But in reality, this fragility is a strategy of survival. It is how whiteness stays centered, how whiteness keeps control, how whiteness insists that even in the moment of critique, it is still the protagonist of the story. What is innocence if not another way of saying, "I'm still the hero, even in your suffering"? So every time the conversation turns into their good intentions, every time we are asked to reassure them that they are not bad people, we must remember this is not dialogue, this is white defense. This is white fragility doing what it does best, recentering whiteness, even in the moment it is being called out. And until innocence is abandoned, no transformation is possible. White fragility does not only defend itself with words, it performs, it dramatizes, it weaponizes emotions. Sometimes it is crocodile tears, sometimes it is outrage, sometimes it is wounded silence. Sometimes it is a trembling voice that says, I feel attacked. Do you see what happens in those moments? Suddenly the center of the conversation is no longer racism, no longer history, no longer domination. The center is the emotional disturbance of the white person who has been critiqued.